Hello, everyone who's watching this video. Today, I'm honored to talk to a great speaker. It's a CEO of Finnish Lifelong Learning Foundation and one of the vice presidents of the European Association for the Education of Adults, Lauri Tuomi. Lauri, hello, and thank you for joining this meeting.
Hello, and many thanks for the invitation for the meeting.
The idea of this talk appeared after the annual conference of the European Association for the Education of Adults, which took place in June and was devoted to the 150th anniversary of the Lifelong Learning Foundation. And without any hesitations, Finland is one of the leading countries in the field of education. And I know that lifelong learning is a core principle which affects both formal and non-formal education. So I'd like to start with a question. What is the place of adult learning and education in the Finnish educational system and maybe beyond it?
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question because as you also said, there is a very long tradition in Finland to create the education system, and education has been one of the ways to raise the Finland as a society to become one of the most and actually at the moment the happiest country in the world, and also one of the best running countries in the world also. So there has been a long tradition to believe in education to provide a better future for us. So lifelong learning is in that sense integrated into our education system. It means that there are no dead ends in the structure. The individual can choose whatever learning path is on that time and place good for her or he, and also that adult education learning is also integrated very closely to different parts of the sector. So today, adult education is integrated to upper secondary education, technical and vocational education, and higher education. But a specific sector in Finland is our non-formal adult education, which is also stated in the organizational chart of the education system. So liberal adult education is what we call that part of our sector, provides adults with the possibilities to learn and choose a huge range of topics and courses in all parts of Finland to train themselves and to be self-motivated to train.
Yeah, thank you. I think that this opportunity to choose from different things is crucial, and probably it also opens many new possibilities for people.
Yes.
And in some countries, the attitude towards adult learning and education is great, like you say, in Nordic countries. But in some countries, it is not that good. And what could be the reason why the Finnish society cultivated this proper attitude throughout the years?
I think, as we said, our foundation is already 150 years old, and on those days, Finland was not even independent. It was an entity on those days, and it was seen that education is something which is very closely linked to national identity, and also a kind of DNA in Finnish mindset that education and adult education and lifelong learning are very important from the societal perspective. But of course, it's important for every citizen and every adult also. So therefore, formal and non-formal education are also very closely linked to each other to support everyone to join education. So that has been one of the prerequisites. But also, of course, the state's role in adult education is important. It's very important that it's stated in the law clearly who are able to join adult education and learning, who are the providers of adult education, and so on. Because then, of course, governmental funding takes a very important place to support that everyone has the opportunity to learn.
Yeah, speaking about the support of the government, of course, it's great when the government supports adult education financially and institutionally. What is the role of the state in the Finnish educational system?
Yes, the state has very important role because, of course, the main part of the funding comes from the national budget. And of course, at the moment, as the whole Europe and your country especially has faced a kind of dramatic challenges for today's world. So, of course, each government need to balance its kind of budgeting, what to target to defense and what to target to education and other parts of the society, for example, well-being. So, of course, in Finland, state funding has faced some cuts also in education system, but in a way because there is the law, specific laws which include state's role in education system and in adult education and learning. It's therefore a kind of saved part of the society and seen very crucial part of the society that state need to has a strong role, and also of course state and ministries have their own important role also. Think about the global collaboration on supporting our globe to be a kind of educational globe as a whole. So, for example, Finland is very active in UNESCO work, OECD actions, and also, of course, in European Union also.
Yeah, all that that you mentioned is really important, I guess. Without any cooperation, it's really difficult to develop the educational system. However, any government, any ministry is created by people, and maybe there is some the mental prerequisite of this good attitude towards lifelong learning, and I'm leading to this special concept of sivistys. Do I spell it right?
Yes, that's a very good question, because as you know, we also have this theme year of sivistys in Finland.
And you have you have it also
at the moment
on your background. Yeah.
Yes. So sivistys is we can of course use the word or term Bildung, for example, which is raised from the German tradition to raise the importance of individuals having the possibility to learn throughout the lifetime. In Nordic countries, and especially in Finland, sivistys has its connections to society very strongly. So sivistys is something, it's more like not only education or something you know in your head. The idea is that sivistys is something which says that you need to do something for your society. You need to develop better world together with others and use your intellectual kind of competencies, and you need to behavior and you need to have morality towards others also. So in this sense, sivistys is connected to all parts of the society. During our theme year, actually all parts of the society have been invited to join. So education, science, arts, culture, museums, libraries, youth actions, and even businesses and other sectors in the society have been invited to think about the importance of sivistys in our society. And as this theme year was set up already 2 years ago, the decision was made. We didn't know that actually today there's a huge demand for sivistys, because sivistys is seen to create also resilience in our society. Also to fight against kind of mal and misinformation and also any kind of behavior which is not welcome in the society or in Europe or in the world. So sivistys is a way to defend also the society.
And probably it would also protect us from happening such things like we have now, like conflicts and wars, and it's
that's true.
It's the best way, just to educate people to avoid it. However,
if I may, sorry, if I may add also that sivistys in the Finnish context is seen very a kind of concept which is very dynamic also. So it can be redefined to be used in different eras. So in the 150 years ago, sivistys was something which was mainly on providing educational opportunities to everyone in order to raise the competence level of the society. But today it's more, it's a wider concept, and it's also connected to all parts of the society.
When I Googled this concept, there were two most common meanings. Like the first one was about a value and an aim for the society, which is synonymous to enlightenment or something like this.
Yes.
And another one is a type of person who is civilized, who lives in harmony with the environment and other people and so on. So how could you explain it maybe very roughly in a short way? Is it possible for people from abroad to understand it in this context, like very as tight as possible?
Yeah, it's of course a kind of abstract term, but in our thinking, sivistys is something which could be seen how you behave, how you kind of communicate with each other, how you use your knowledge and skills for the society and the others also. So it's something which is which create a kind of human and advanced society. So, but it's very kind of, it can be very practical also, and we see that sivistys can be seen and used everywhere if you just have the mindset.
Yeah, in a practical way, we can see how Finland developed from a country which was quite poor to a well-developed country, very prosperous and perspective. So the way it works, I guess.
Yeah, and also connected to learning and adult education learning, it means that you don't learn by yourself, so or that it's not enough. The best way to learn is to learn together. In the communities, wherever you are, you can use informal learning, non-formal and formal learning, but you need to learn together, and that creates actually common sense on sivistys.
Yeah, it gives the best results, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
And we speak a lot about the role of the society, and I also wanted to ask about the role of civil society in adult learning and education in Finland. I will provide example from Ukraine. Like with the start of the full-scale invasion, the role of civil society raised significantly. People unite their efforts to combat the enemy in their own ways as they can.
Yes.
And we have some examples when, for example, participants of sewing courses, we have a partner in Nikopol, and the participants of the sewing courses there started creating underwear and backpacks for the frontline soldiers. And there are so many cases like this when people who were learning something start doing other good things for their society. So how does it work in your context, in the context of your country?
Yes, first of all, I really admire how things have been done and how civil society has been raised in Ukraine, because it has been very crucial, and it's crucial in Finnish society also today. Finland has been one of the countries which is full of associations and communities and volunteers to do whatever they have decided to think about what is good for the community itself or the region or or the society as a whole. So civil society has a crucial role, and we have been very happy that also our state has funded a lot of civil society actions, and civil society has been seen very important, thinking the connection to sivistys itself, but also thinking about the resilience in the societies, thinking about the well-being of the society. So civil society has acted in many ways to support the state in its actions, because of course Finland is also a very small country, and small population, so everyone's kind of role has been seen important, and it still is the same issue today. And also civil society, as you said, also it's a like I said, that sivistys is something to learn together. So civil society organizations provide learning opportunities. If you are a volunteer in any actions to save, for example, to nature, or you volunteer to support kind of organizing events to those target groups which do not have enough funds to participate, and so on. So this kind of actions are all very important, and also the learning opportunities they provide is important. And I'm quite happy to say that quite many civil society organizations have very close connections to education institutes, so they collaborate a lot and have their own projects and any action which can be seen as collaborative actions.
Yeah, and I think it's great when there are such collaborations, because that is what produces something new, and also empowers other people, and that's cool. Okay, and also I wonder what are the target groups of adult learning and education in Finland, because usually in different countries there are some peculiarities of these types of audience.
Yes, of course, in Finland also we have specific target groups, but I would say that the main target group, especially for the non-formal adult education, is actually all citizens, because the sector is actually said in our law for liberal adult education also that it should provide everyone an opportunity to learn and develop themselves. So all of the citizens have the possibility to join the operations of liberal and non-formal adult education. But of course today also think about adult education and learning as a whole. The working age population needs reskilling and upskilling. That's of course a specific kind of target group because of digitalization, new technologies, and changing working life. That's in this sense, of course, important, thinking about Finland's competitiveness and also thinking that also on Europe as a whole. Then, of course, specific target groups are immigrants, for which the special kind of idea is to integrate them to the society and provide language learning, citizenship skills, and other skills to integrate. And some specific groups also in Finland are which have lack of basic skills. Even though Finland is one of the most literate countries in the world, there are some groups which need to kind of taken into the idea of lifelong learning and provide also, of course, first basic skills and then continuity in their learning.
What you said about the majority of people who can get something from this market of adult learning education services is just something we can strive for, because now I guess not all of the people have some opportunity to join such courses. Sometimes because of lack of I don't know, time, resources, whatever, but there are many obstacles. And speaking about some challenges and obstacles that you have in your adult learning and education system in Finland, are there any? Because it seems like you have perfect adult learning education, and we might sound a bit biased. So maybe something comes to your mind.
Yes, one is also that, of course, as we have a state of lifelong learning, of course, there are not all Finns who participate, but of course, the participation rate is really high compared to other European countries. About 27% of the adult population participate adult education annually. It means that it's more like 1 million adults who participate, so 1/5 of the country population participates annually. But of course, the idea is to raise also the participation level and find those groups who are not kind of enlightened in the lifelong learning. We have seen, and in Europe as a whole also is seen that the participants who participate lifelong learning actions are the same persons year after year. So it's a kind of cumulative way to raise competencies. And then we need to especially target to those groups who should be taken into the learning paths and provide them opportunities to learn. And sometimes it's the lack of basic skills and learning, lifelong learning skills may lack also. And therefore, there are also challenges or actions which need to be taken into Finland also into account. And as I said, of course, this current situation in thinking about our national budget, it means that adult education providers need to think about how they prioritize their offering and which are the main target groups in order to ensure that everywhere in Finland there are opportunities for citizens to participate.
The last one, I guess, is very common problem because almost everywhere the actors in the field of adult education should prioritize and have a very strict emphasis on what target groups they are going to focus on and so on.
If I may add one specific point is that, of course, Finland is based also in a way that and the education system has been very successful because of the competent teachers. So teachers training for trainers are a kind of there is a continuous need because there are hundreds of kind of more than 100,000 teachers in Finland, or part-time teachers also more. So this kind of teachers' competencies are important because also, of course, learning is also changing how we learn and how we use technology and online learning opportunities. So that means that there is a need for train the teachers also.
Absolutely. And do you mean that you have a special trainings for teachers for the adults? Like you develop these courses for teachers or do something? How does it work? Could you explain a bit? Because it's very interesting. I guess we have a problem in Ukraine with that we don't have that much teachers who are trained to work especially with adults, and usually we have trainers who work with both like students at universities and adults, and it's a kind of mixed audience. So do you have any special things about it?
Yes, sure. Of course, the universities provide the basic education for teachers to start their career, but also thinking about, for example, the technical and vocational education, in Finland, there's a long tradition to train those teachers, especially for the field, and also in that specific training or teachers' competence training to adults have a kind of strong role, and adult pedagogy has strong role. And there is a connection, and one of the main ideas is that teachers' education is connected to the newest information and data given by research. So it's based on the research on pedagogy, and also the adult education science is quite strong in Finland, and therefore there are a lot of specific courses and actions which are provided especially for teachers in adult education. But that's a kind of, as I said, there's a continuous need for training the trainers and teachers.
Yeah, and what you said about being up to date, the teachers also learn the newest things, and it's what you need in our everyday life to keep up with the time and to be effective, I guess, in whatever we do. Okay, and the last question I wanted to ask is what are the key priorities of adult learning and education development nowadays? Maybe in terms of your foundation activities.
Yes, the main priorities, I would say that we also follow the European Union kind of statement that leave no one behind. So try to outreach the groups who need especially learning opportunities and training. That's one of the key priorities. Then, as I said, specific kind of basic skills or new basic skills, so to say, digital skills. We call it digital sivistys, which means it's a kind of wider perspective to digital skills in order to also act towards misinformation, malinformation, and have literacy skills and media literacy skills. Those are one of the specific points in our foundation also, but also the new use of new technology, not only artificial intelligence, but also robotics and any kind of new innovations which could be used to support the learning process. That's also one of the specific priorities. And then, as I said, teachers' competencies are crucial in order to have a happiest country by education in the future. Also, that's one of the priority. And also, we see somehow also, as we have this theme year of sivistys, that next year when we report and we analyze all the results of this theme year, we kind of expect that we will get new kind of ideas for the future and raise new priorities, but we probably don't know yet all of those priorities. So let's discuss next year again.
Brainstorm.
So,
exchange of ideas. Great.
Maybe just to, if I may raise some topics from the European perspective and in Finnish perspective, also the recognition of learning, both non-formal and formal learning in adult education, and even informal learning will be very important. It's one of the priorities also currently in Finland, that non-formal education could provide support for adults to also to get recognized by their competencies. We have created in Finland a kind of national digital repository for lifelong learning purposes. So that's something which is a continuous priority at the moment also. So the next step is how to recognize informal learning.
Okay, sounds ambitious, and I think you will be able to manage this step. That's great.
Let's hope, of course, with the collaboration with European partners also.
Okay. And at last, Lauri, is there anything I didn't ask you, but you would like to share? Maybe something important, or maybe something you would like to say to the Ukrainian audience?
I would like to say, I think we covered very well all the topics I had in my mind, and I'm really happy to share the ideas from Finland. I would like to share also the idea that Finland is strongly supporting Ukraine, and hopefully we can collaborate also on adult education and learning and civil society actions with you and with of course with European partners. Of course, this collaboration and also different kind of actions we have on European level, I think those are very important for us, and also sharing good and best practices. I'm quite certain that in Ukraine we can find also very much good practices, because you have special kind of situation, very kind of dramatic situation, but it creates sometimes new approaches and innovations to be resilient for the future. So that's something I would like to say also.
Thank you, and thank you for the support. I think that the majority of Ukrainians appreciate the support from representatives of other countries and the governments of other countries, and Finland in particular. So thank you so much. And I think that this exchange of ideas and exchange of practices is actually one of the keys of making adult education in Europe better, and we are on this way all together. Lauri, thank you so much once again for your time, for this kind of conversation. I feel inspired, and I hope that those people who will watch this video will also be inspired, in particular actors in adult learning and education. I will remind that this conversation became possible thanks to DVV International Ukraine. So have a nice day and bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.